Hello and welcome back. If you are here tonight, then you are exactly where you need to be. Somewhere quiet, somewhere still, perhaps in bed, the covers pulled up close, the day already fading behind you like a long road disappearing into the dark. The world outside can wait. Whatever it asked of you today, whatever it asked of you this week, it can wait a little longer. Because right now, we are going somewhere else entirely. We are going far, very far, across oceans of sand and centuries of time, to a place where the ground itself seemed to glitter, where caravans stretched so long they vanished over the horizon before they had even fully left the city, and where a man once existed whose wealth was so enormous, so staggering, so incomprehensibly vast, that even in the modern age, with all of our spreadsheets and satellites and economists and financial analysts, no one has ever quite been able to measure it. Tonight, we are going to tell the story of Mansa Musa, the emperor, the pilgrim, the builder, the man who, for one brief and brilliant span of years in the 14th century, held more gold in his hands than perhaps any single human being has ever held before or since. So close your eyes if you like. Let your breathing slow. Let your body settle into the softness beneath you. And let history do what it does best. Let it carry you gently away. And before we begin in earnest, if these slow, calm journeys through the past help you drift off to sleep, it would mean the world to me if you took just one small moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are a small, peaceful little corner of history here on YouTube, and right now I am working toward 1,000 subscribers. 1,000. It is a humble goal, but it is mine, and every single person who joins makes it feel a little more possible. So if you feel moved, like the video, subscribe, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is on your clock. And if you still have any sleepy little hype left in you, send it my way. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Now, let us return to the sand and the gold and the man who changed the world simply by walking through it. There is something deeply human about the idea of wealth. Not the cold, abstract kind that lives in numbers on a screen, but the tangible kind, the heavy kind, the kind you can hold in your hand and feel the weight of, warm from the sun. For most of human history, that weight was gold, and no story in all of human history involves more gold, more genuine, staggering, world-altering gold than the story of Mansa Musa. His modern estimated net worth, calculated by historians and economists trying to compare his resources to today's standards, is often placed at around $400 billion. Some estimates go even higher, suggesting the number is simply incalculable, that the very concept of trying to pin down his wealth in modern terms is a bit like trying to measure an ocean with a teaspoon. What we do know is this. At the peak of his reign, the Empire of Mali produced somewhere close to half of the entire world's known gold supply. Not a region's gold, not a continent's gold, half of all the gold on Earth that people knew about and traded and fought over and coveted. It passed through his hands, it answered to him, and he used it in ways that were by turns astonishing, generous, bewildering, and world-changing. But before we can understand Mansa Musa the man, we have to understand the world that made him, because great rulers do not emerge from nothing. They emerge from a specific place, a specific time, a specific current of history that has been building long before they arrive. And the current that carried Mansa Musa was old and deep, and it ran through the heart of West Africa like the Niger River itself, broad, quiet, and full of life. Let the story begin. Section 1. The World Before Musa, Ancient West Africa and the Roots of the Mali Empire. To understand where Mansa Musa came from, you have to understand a landscape that most of the world, even today, tends to underestimate. West Africa in the medieval period was not the isolated, forgotten corner of the earth that later European narratives sometimes tried to paint it as. It was a living, breathing, sophisticated region of the world, threaded through with ancient trade routes, governed by complex kingdoms, and home to millions of people who had been building cities, writing laws, trading goods, and developing religious and intellectual traditions for longer than many European civilizations had existed. The geography of West Africa is a story told in layers. In the far north, there is the Sahara Desert, an immense and intimidating sea of sand and stone and heat that seems to forbid passage. For centuries, outsiders assumed it was an impassable barrier, a natural wall that cut off the interior of Africa from the rest of the known world. But the people of West Africa knew better. They knew the desert the way a sailor knows the ocean, not as a wall, but as a road. And across that road, for hundreds of years before Mansa Musa ever drew his first breath, caravans had been moving. Slowly, patiently, guided by generations of knowledge passed down through families and communities, those caravans crossed the Sahara, carrying goods that the whole world wanted. Salt was one of them. This might seem surprising today, in an age when salt is so cheap and so common that we barely think about it. But in the medieval world, salt was survival. Salt preserved food. Salt flavored food. Salt was absolutely essential to health and life. And in the sub-Saharan regions of West Africa, it was relatively rare. Meanwhile, in the vast salt flats of the Sahara, particularly in the region of Tagaza, there were mines that produced slabs of salt so pure and so valuable that they were literally used as currency. Men carved blocks of salt out of the earth, loaded them onto camels, and carried them south across the desert, where they were traded for gold, for ivory, for cola nuts, for captives, for all the goods that the north wanted and the south produced. Gold was the other great commodity, and here the geography of West Africa was almost unreasonably generous. Deep in the forested regions south of the savannah and along the banks of rivers that fed into the great Niger, there were deposits of alluvial gold so rich that people could literally find nuggets lying in streambeds after the rains. The gold fields of Bambouk, Bure, and later Akan were among the richest deposits anywhere in the medieval world, and they fed a trade network that stretched all the way to North Africa, to the Middle East, to Europe. By the time the Mali Empire rose to prominence, this trade network had already been operating for centuries. It had supported earlier kingdoms. The Ghana Empire, which occupied a different territory than the modern nation of Ghana, but shared its spiritual heritage, had grown rich and powerful for several centuries precisely by controlling the routes along which gold and salt moved. Ghana was not a gold-producing region itself, not primarily. Its genius was positioning. It sat between the gold fields to the south and the salt mines to the north, and it taxed everything that passed. Every merchant who moved through Ghana's territory paid a toll. Every transaction was recorded and regulated. It was an elegant economic system, simple in concept but powerful in practice, and it made Ghana one of the most prosperous kingdoms in the world for a very long time. But nothing lasts forever, and the Ghana Empire declined over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, battered by the Almoravid invasions from the north, undermined by changing trade routes, and gradually fragmented by internal pressures. Its collapse left a power vacuum in the Western Sudan, that great belt of semi-arid land that stretches across West Africa south of the Sahara. And into that vacuum, like water finding its level, the peoples and kingdoms of the region began to reorganize. Among them were the Mandinka people, and among the Mandinka there was a lineage of rulers, the Keita dynasty, who would eventually produce the Mali Empire, the largest and richest empire West Africa had ever seen.
The foundation of that empire was not laid by Mansa Musa. It was laid by a man who was, in many ways, even more remarkable. A man who transformed from a sickly, despised child into a warrior king. A man whose story became one of the greatest epic narratives in African history. His name was Sundiata Keita, and it is with his legend that the Mali Empire truly begins. The world Sundiata was born into, sometime in the early 13th century, was one of fragmented kingdoms and competing chieftaincies, where the Mandinka people lived under the domination of a powerful neighboring kingdom called Soso, led by a king named Sumanguru Kante. Sumanguru was feared and powerful, a sorcerer king in the oral traditions, a man of terrifying magical abilities as well as military strength. Under his dominion, the Mandinka was subjugated, their chiefs humiliated, their people taxed and diminished. Into this world, Sundiata was born with the seemingly inauspicious burden of being unable to walk. He was a child who could not stand, who dragged himself along the ground, who was mocked by his father's other wives, and considered useless by those around him. His mother was a hunchbacked woman named Sogolon, brought to the king as a bride because of a prophecy that she would produce a great son. And for many years it looked very much as though the prophecy had failed. But stories have a way of turning at the exact moment you least expect them to. One day, according to the oral tradition preserved by the griots, the hereditary storytellers and historians of West Africa, Sundiata stood up. He reportedly grasped an iron rod and bent it with the force of his rising, and he stood on his own feet for the first time. From that moment forward, he never looked back. The rest of his story is the stuff of legend: exile, wandering, the gathering of allies, the return, the final confrontation with Sumanguru Kanti, and the decisive battle of Kirina around the year 1235, where Sundiata and his confederacy broke the power of Soso and established the framework of what would become the Mali Empire. He was, by all accounts, a military and political genius, a man who understood not just how to win battles, but how to build alliances, how to integrate conquered peoples, how to create a governing structure that could hold a vast and diverse empire together. The empire he founded would endure for centuries, and it is within this empire, as the descendant of the very dynasty Sundiata established, that Mansa Musa would one day be born. Section 2. The Legend of Sundiata and the Keita Dynasty. The Keita dynasty that Sundiata established was not simply a line of rulers passing a crown from hand to hand.
It was a living institution, rooted in oral tradition, sustained by the griots who memorized and performed its history, and legitimized by a complex web of Islamic faith, traditional African spiritual practice, military power, and economic control. To be a member of the Keita dynasty in the 13th and 14th centuries was to carry an enormous weight of expectation and meaning.
Sundiata himself ruled until around 1255, though the exact dates of his reign are uncertain, filtered as they are through centuries of oral transmission and the relatively sparse written records of the period. What the records and the oral tradition both agree on is that he established a powerful and well-organized empire, one that stretched from the Atlantic coast of West Africa deep into the interior, encompassing the great bend of the Niger River and the rich agricultural lands of the Western Sudan. He set up a capital at a place called Niani, thought to have been located in what is now the border region between modern Guinea and Mali. And from Niani, the Keita kings governed their vast domain. The governance system that Sundiata established was, for its time and place, remarkably sophisticated. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a governor who answered to the central authority of the Mansa in Niani. The word Mansa itself is worth pausing on for a moment. It comes from the Mandinka language and can be translated variously as king, emperor, conqueror, or sultan. It carried immense weight. To be Mansa was not just to hold political power. It was to occupy a position at the intersection of the spiritual and the secular, to be the embodiment of the empire's identity, its prosperity, and its relationship with the divine.
The Mali Empire, under the Keita dynasty, was also, from relatively early in its history, a Muslim empire. Or more precisely, it was an empire in which Islam coexisted with and gradually infused traditional African religious practices. Sundiata himself is remembered in some traditions as having been a devotee of traditional religion, while other accounts describe him as a Muslim. What is clear is that the rulers of Mali generally maintained a flexible approach to religion, practicing Islam while also respecting and participating in traditional spiritual customs that held meaning for their subjects. This was pragmatic as much as spiritual. A king who acknowledged both the God of Islam and the ancestral spirits of his people could command loyalty from a wider population. Over the generations that followed Sundiata, the Keita dynasty continued to expand and consolidate the empire. His son, Uli Keita, reportedly made a pilgrimage to Mecca, establishing a tradition that would later find its most spectacular expression in Mansa Musa's own journey. Successive Mansa Kolu, the plural of Mansa, governed the empire with varying degrees of competence and ambition, some expanding its territory, others consolidating what they had, a few presiding over periods of difficulty and contraction.
By the time we reached the late 13th century, the Mali Empire was enormous. It stretched in a great arc across West Africa, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east, from the southern edge of the Sahara in the north to the forests of the Guinea coast in the south. Within this territory, there were dozens of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and cultures, all bound together by the common political authority of the Mansa, the common thread of Islamic faith among the ruling class, and the common economic interest of the trans-Saharan trade that enriched all of them. The trans-Saharan trade was the lifeblood of the empire in the most literal sense. It was the mechanism by which gold, the commodity that made Mali famous, moved from the fields and rivers where it was collected
to the markets of North Africa and the wider world. The empire's wealth derived not primarily from the Mansa personally owning all the gold, though royal reserves were indeed immense, but from the empire's position as the controlling authority over the trade. Merchants who moved goods through Mali's territory paid taxes and duties. Those who wanted to buy gold had to deal with Mali's merchants and under Mali's terms. And because there was simply no other comparable source of gold in the medieval world, Mali's leverage was enormous.
Into this world, into this dynasty, into this empire, Mansa Musa was born. Probably around the year 1280, though precise birth records are not available. He was born as Musa Keita, a member of the royal family, a great-nephew of Sundiata through the line of Sundiata's brother Abu Bakr Keita. His father was Faga Laye, and neither his father nor his grandfather had sat on the throne. There was no particular reason to expect that Musa would either. The line of succession in the Mali Empire was not always straightforward, not always governed by primogeniture, the passing of power from father to eldest son, but by a more complex system in which the Mansa had the power to appoint a deputy, a Khalifa, who would serve in his place during his absence, and was sometimes, though not always, his successor. And it was this system, this practice of appointing a deputy, that ultimately placed Musa on the throne of the richest empire in the world. Section 3. The Mystery of Abu Bakr II, the king who sailed into the unknown. The story of how Mansa Musa came to power is one of the more remarkable and intriguing tales in all of medieval history, and it begins not with Musa himself, but with his predecessor, a man known as Abu Bakr II, also called Abu Bakr Keita II, who was the 9th Mansa of the Mali Empire. Abu Bakr II came to power around 1310 or 1311, and by all accounts he was a capable and ambitious ruler. But it is not his governance that makes him memorable. It is what he did at the end of his reign, or rather what he is said to have done, because the exact events are known only through Mansa Musa's own later account, filtered through the records of Arab historians. According to the account that Mansa Musa gave to the Egyptian scholar Al-Umari during his visit to Cairo, Abu Bakr II became obsessed with a question that had apparently been nagging at him for some time. What lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean? The Mali Empire had access to the Atlantic coast in the west, and from that coast sailors could look out at the vast expanse of open water stretching to the horizon and beyond. Abu Bakr II, it seems, was consumed by curiosity about what lay on the other side. He decided to find out. According to Musa's account, Abu Bakr organized a fleet of 2,000 canoes, divided equally between the expedition proper and a support fleet carrying food and supplies. He sent them out into the Atlantic. None of them returned. Rather than abandoning the venture, Abu Bakr organized a second expedition, this one reportedly larger and better equipped, with 4,000 boats in total. And then, according to Mansa Musa, Abu Bakr II himself got on a boat, placed Musa in charge of the kingdom as his deputy, and sailed west into the Atlantic. He was never seen again. The fate of Abu Bakr II and his fleet is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The most straightforward explanation is that the expedition was overcome by the powerful currents and winds of the Atlantic, that the boats were not equipped for open ocean sailing, and that the people aboard perished. This is almost certainly what happened to most or all of the fleet. that there is a more intriguing possibility that some historians have entertained over the years. The winds and currents of the central Atlantic run in such a way that a fleet departing from the West African coast would, if it survived, be carried in a broad arc toward the Caribbean or the coast of South America. Some researchers have speculated that Abu Bakr's expedition, or some portion of it, might have reached the Americas, that this was, in other words, a case of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, a crossing of the Atlantic more than a century and a half before Christopher Columbus. The Arab historian al-Umari, writing based on his conversations with people who had spoken with Mansa Musa directly, recorded the story of this expedition and noted the scale of Abu Bakr's ambition. Various scholars and researchers have pointed to certain similarities between West African material culture and some artifacts and practices found in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica as possible supporting evidence, though this remains deeply speculative and contested. To govern the Mali Empire in the 14th century was not a simple task. The empire was, by any standard of the medieval world, enormous. Mansa Musa himself reportedly told visitors that it would take a traveler an entire year to cross his domain from one end to the other. This was almost certainly an exaggeration, or at least a generous rounding, but the underlying truth it conveyed was real. Mali was vast. Vast in a way that required not just military might, but organizational genius, diplomatic skill, and a sophisticated understanding of economics, religion, and human nature. When Musa took the throne, he inherited an empire that was already wealthy and already well organized. The structures of governance that Sundiata had established, the provincial system, the appointment of governors, the integration of diverse peoples under a common authority, had been refined and adjusted by successive Mansa-Kolu over the generations. The trans-Saharan trade was running smoothly, the gold fields were productive, the salt trade was profitable. Mali was, in many respects, a well-oiled machine. Musa's first task was to ensure that it stayed that way, and then to make it better. He was by all accounts deeply conscientious about governance. He appointed reliable governors to the provinces of his empire, men who could be trusted to collect taxes fairly, administer justice, keep order, and report faithfully to the center. He maintained a standing army. The sources vary on its exact size, but it was substantial, tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry and infantry, which kept the empire secure from external threats and internal rebellions alike. He was also, from very early in his reign, a deeply committed Muslim. This was not unusual among the rulers of Mali, as we have seen, but Musa's devotion was more intense and more personal than that of many of his predecessors. He prayed 5 times a day. He fasted during Ramadan with genuine commitment. He studied the Quran. He valued learning and scholarship in a way that went beyond mere performance of piety. He understood that Islam, and particularly the scholarly culture of Islamic civilization, offered something genuinely enriching to his empire, a connection to a vast intellectual world that stretched from Andalusia in the west to Central Asia and beyond, a tradition of learning, law, architecture, astronomy, medicine, and theology that was, in the 14th century, the most sophisticated and comprehensive body of knowledge in the world. This intellectual orientation would become one of the defining characteristics of his reign. But before he could fully express it, before he could bring the scholars and architects and poets of the Islamic world to his court, there was a journey he needed to make. A journey that every Muslim was supposed to make at least once in their lifetime. A journey to the holy city of Mecca in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, where the Prophet Muhammad had received his revelation, and where the Kaaba, the ancient stone building at the center of the Grand Mosque, stood as the most sacred point on earth for nearly 1 billion people in Musa's time, and more than 1.5 billion today. In the language of Islam, this journey is called the Hajj, and for Mansa Musa, the 10th Mansa of the Mali Empire, with all the resources of the richest kingdom in the world at his disposal, the Hajj was not going to be a quiet, private act of devotion. It was going to be an event. Section 5. The Gold and Salt of Mali, the engine of infinite wealth. Before we can fully appreciate what Mansa Musa's pilgrimage meant, before we can truly understand the scale of what happened when he walked out of his empire and into the wider world, we need to spend some time with the foundation of his wealth, because without understanding where all that gold actually came from, the story feels almost like fantasy. And it was not fantasy. It was geography. It was trade. It was centuries of careful and intelligent economic management. It was the land itself, generous almost beyond belief. The gold of the Mali Empire came primarily from 3 great mining regions. Bambouk, located in the area that is now western Mali and eastern Senegal, was one of the oldest and most productive goldfields in West Africa, and it had been producing gold for centuries before Mansa Musa's time. Bouré, located further east along the upper Niger River, was another major source, one that had contributed greatly to Mali's wealth since Sundiata's time. And as the empire expanded under Musa and his predecessors, it brought other gold-producing regions into its orbit as well. The gold was extracted primarily through alluvial mining, panning for gold in rivers and stream beds, where the action of water over millennia had concentrated gold particles and nuggets in certain locations. This was not a highly mechanized process. It required human labor, patience, and knowledge. The miners, who were often from specific communities with hereditary expertise in finding and extracting gold, would work the rivers and banks, collecting gold dust and nuggets that they then sold to merchants who carried it north on the trans-Saharan caravan routes. At the height of the Mali Empire, it is estimated that West Africa was producing somewhere between 6 and 9 tons of gold per year, and the vast majority of that gold moved through the empire's territory. Since Mali taxed the movement of goods through its lands, each transaction contributed to the imperial treasury. But Musa also directly controlled certain mines and certain trading centers, ensuring that some of the most productive sources of gold fed directly into royal coffers. The salt trade was equally important, and in some ways even more fundamental to the daily life of the empire. Salt was extracted from the mines at Tagaza and Taudeni, deep in the Sahara, and it moved south in great slabs that were so valuable they were sometimes used as currency. A slab of Tagaza salt could be sold for its weight in gold in certain markets. The exchange rate fluctuated, of course, depending on supply and distance and demand, but the basic equation was simple and beautiful in its symmetry. The north had salt and wanted gold. The south had gold and wanted salt. Mali sat in the middle, controlled the routes, set the rules, and grew rich on the traffic. Beyond gold and salt, the empire's economy rested on several other pillars. Agriculture along the Niger River and its tributaries was highly productive. The river flooded annually, leaving rich deposits of silt on the surrounding farmland, and the populations of cities like Djenné and Timbuktu were fed by this agricultural abundance. Cattle, millet, sorghum, fish. The empire was not merely wealthy in traded commodities, but genuinely prosperous in the basic necessities of life, which in turn supported a large and growing population. Ivory was another significant export. The elephants of West Africa produced ivory that was prized across the Islamic world and beyond, carved into luxury goods, decorative objects, and musical instruments. Kola nuts, which have mild stimulant properties and were used in religious ceremonies and social rituals across the region, were traded northward as well. The variety of the empire's exports was a source of resilience. No single commodity was so dominant that its loss would collapse the whole system. And then there was human commerce, which is the darkest thread in the story, and one that must be acknowledged honestly. The trans-Saharan trade included among its many commodities enslaved people. West African rulers, including the rulers of Mali, participated in this trade, both as sellers and as buyers. Enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa were among the goods that moved north across the Sahara to North Africa, Egypt, and the Middle East. The institution of slavery in medieval Mali was complex and different in some ways from the chattel slavery that would later devastate Africa in the Atlantic slave trade. But it was real, it was significant, and it was woven into the economic fabric of the empire. Mansa Musa himself traveled to Mecca with thousands of enslaved people as part of his entourage, and this was considered entirely normal and appropriate by the standards of his time. We note it here because history must be told whole, not only in its bright moments. The combined effect of all these economic forces was an empire of extraordinary wealth. Not the fictional fairy tale wealth of stories, but the real, hard, heavy, practical wealth of a working economic system that produced things the world needed and moved them to where they were wanted. Mansa Musa did not discover this wealth. He inherited it, carefully husbanded it, expanded it, and then did something extraordinary with it. He took a large portion of it, loaded it onto camels and horses and the backs of thousands of men and women, and carried it across the Sahara Desert, through Egypt, and across the Arabian Peninsula to the holy city of Mecca. And in doing so, he changed the world. It helps in understanding the true scale of Mali's economic dominance to think about what gold meant in the 14th century world. Gold was not merely currency in the sense that we understand modern money, a symbolic token whose value is guaranteed by a government. Gold was intrinsically valuable. It could not be manufactured. It could only be found, and the places in the world where it could be found in significant quantities were few. The gold fields of West Africa were, without question, the single most productive and important source of gold in the entire medieval world. Estimates suggest that at the height of Mali's prosperity, somewhere between 40 and 50% of all the gold circulating in the economies of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East had originated in West African soil. Think about what that means. Half of all the money, half of all the wealth, half of all the gold coins being counted in the markets of Cairo and the mints of Florence and the treasuries of English kings, all of it, or at least half of it, had passed through the hands of merchants who were subject to the authority of the Mansa of Mali. This gave the empire a kind of global economic leverage that was almost without parallel. Mali did not need to conquer Europe or the Middle East to influence their economies. It simply had to continue doing what it was already doing, producing gold and selling it on its own terms through the caravan routes of the Sahara. The kings of Europe sent their own gold coins to pay for spices from the East, and silk from China, and ivory from Africa. Those coins ultimately traced back in large proportion to the mines of Bambouk and Bure. There was an invisible thread of economic dependency stretching from the counting houses of Venice and Genoa all the way to the riverbanks of the Niger, and that thread ran directly through the hands of Mansa Musa. He understood this power, at least intuitively. The records suggest that he was careful about maintaining the conditions that made the trade possible. He kept the roads safe. He enforced honest weights and measures in the markets. He maintained diplomatic relationships with the leaders of North Africa, who controlled the northern ends of the caravan routes, ensuring that the movement of goods was not disrupted by political conflicts. He was, in the language of economics, a market maker, not just a participant in the system, but one of its key architects and guardians.
There was also the matter of how the empire managed the gold at its source. The gold fields of Mali were subject to a carefully maintained system of royal authority and controlled access. The Mansa held the right to any large nugget of gold found in the empire's territory, while smaller gold dust could be traded more freely. This system, which sounds almost arbitrary, served a crucial economic purpose. By keeping large nuggets out of circulation and in the royal treasury, the empire prevented any single cache of gold from flooding the market and depressing prices. It was, in essence, a medieval form of supply management, and it was remarkably sophisticated for its era. The value of gold depended on its relative scarcity, and Mali's rulers understood this and acted on it. In the markets of the south, salt was traded for gold dust, with the exchange rate varying by distance from the mines and the current supply. At its most extreme, stories tell of salt being traded weight for weight against gold in certain markets far from the Saharan sources. Whether this was literally true or a storyteller's exaggeration is hard to know, but it captures something real about the relative value of the commodity in different locations. Salt that was cheap and abundant in the north was precious and scarce in the south, where the local geology produced none. Gold that was relatively accessible in the riverbed mines of the Niger watershed was a rarity in the north. The entire economy of the trans-Saharan trade was built on this geographical asymmetry, and Mali sat precisely at the fulcrum. The Niger River itself deserves a moment of appreciation as the physical backbone of the empire's internal economy. This great river, the third longest in Africa, sweeps in a great arc through West Africa, rising in the Guinea highlands in the far west, flowing northeast through what is now Guinea and Mali, reaching its northernmost point near Timbuktu, where it comes within 200 miles of the Sahara, and then bending sharply southeast to flow through modern Niger and Nigeria before emptying into the Gulf of Guinea. Along its entire course, and especially in the great inland delta region, where it spreads into a complex network of channels and lakes and seasonal floodplains, the Niger was a highway of commerce and a source of agricultural abundance.
River merchants used dugout canoes and flat-bottomed boats to move goods along the Niger and its tributaries, connecting the great trading cities of the interior, Djenné, Timbuktu, Gao, to the agricultural hinterlands, and to each other. Grain, fish, cloth, pottery, and livestock moved along these waterways in both directions, sustaining an urban population that could not have fed itself without the river's bounty. The river was also, of course, a source of water in a region where water was a precious resource, and the annual flood that replenished the soil of the inland delta was treated with deep reverence and celebrated in ritual and tradition. All of this, the gold, the salt, the river trade, the agricultural surplus, the artisan production, the caravan commerce, added up to an economic reality that was, by the standards of the 14th century, staggering, and Mansa Musa governed it all.
Mansa Musa was going to do something different. He was going to make a pilgrimage that announced Mali to the world. Whether this was a conscious, deliberate act of diplomacy and public relations, which some historians believe, or simply the natural expression of who Musa was, a man whose generosity and grandeur were simply too large to be contained even by the ordinary practice of devotion, is something we can never fully know. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps Musa understood instinctively that the Hajj was not merely a private spiritual obligation, but an opportunity. An opportunity to show the Islamic world, and through the Islamic world, Europe and the rest of humanity, exactly who he was and what his empire was capable of. The preparations took years. This was not an impulsive journey, not a sudden decision made one morning and acted on the next. Musa spent considerable time and resources organizing an entourage that would be appropriate to his station and his intentions. He appointed a deputy, as was the custom, to govern Mali in his absence. He ensured that the empire's administration was in order, that his generals were positioned where they needed to be, that the revenue systems were running smoothly. A king who leaves his kingdom for a year or more without adequate preparation is asking for trouble, and Musa was far too careful a ruler to make that mistake. The entourage he assembled for the journey was by any measure one of the largest and most spectacular in the history of human travel. The sources vary in their specific numbers, and ancient and medieval accounts are often prone to exaggeration for effect, but the scale described by multiple independent observers is consistent enough to believe. The most commonly cited figure is 60,000 people. 60,000. Men and women, soldiers and servants, scholars and officials, merchants and entertainers. Some of them marched on foot, others rode horses or camels. They were organized into a moving city, a procession that stretched for miles across the landscape, filling the air with dust and the sound of thousands of footsteps and hooves. Among the 60,000, there were reportedly 12,000 young men who served as personal attendants to the Mansa, each one dressed in silk brocade, each one carrying a gold staff. There were also reported to be 12,000 enslaved women who served as attendants, and 80 camels, though some sources say more, each carrying between 300 and 600 pounds of gold dust. There were also horses, countless horses, and cattle and sheep, and supplies enough to sustain this enormous moving community across thousands of miles of desert and road. The gold that the caravan carried was not merely for personal use on the journey. Musa intended to give it away. He intended to give it away on an astonishing scale, to every beggar who crossed his path, to every city he passed through, to every mosque and shrine and holy site along the route. Almsgiving, zakat, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, a fundamental obligation of the faith. For Mansa Musa,
almsgiving was not a symbolic act. It was not a token donation or a percentage tithe. It was the expression of a personality so large, a generosity so deep, that it overwhelmed the very economic systems it encountered. The route from Niani to Mecca was roughly 6,000 miles, a journey that would take many months even at a reasonable traveling pace, and a great deal longer when you are moving 60,000 people across the Sahara Desert. Musa organized the departure with care, timing it to take advantage of the relatively cooler desert months and the established caravan routes that were best supplied with water and provisions. The empire's reach extended into the Saharan trading routes, and Musa used this reach to ensure that supply stops and resting points were available along the way. In the 17th year of his reign, 1324, the caravan departed. Section 7. The Great Procession, Crossing the Sahara. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine it. Just for a moment. Try to hold the image in your mind. The sun rising over the West African savanna. The horizon still pink at the edges. The air already warm, though the day is barely begun. And moving across the landscape, moving slowly and steadily eastward toward the rising sun, an extraordinary column of humanity. Silk catching the light, gold glinting from staffs and ornaments and the laden backs of camels. The sound of drums, perhaps, marking the pace. The murmur of prayers as the devout among the 60,000 began their day with worship. The smell of cooking fires and animal dung and human perspiration. And underneath it all, the clean, dry scent of the Hamatan wind coming down off the Sahara. The great procession of Mansa Musa was moving. The caravan route that Musa followed was not entirely unprecedented. The trans-Saharan trade routes had been in use for centuries, and there were established paths, known watering points, and trading towns that served as waypoints for travelers crossing the desert. But the scale of Musa's caravan dwarfed anything those routes had ever carried. At its full extent, the procession stretched so far along the road that the front was already settling into camp for the night before the rear had finished leaving the morning's camp.
The Sahara in the 14th century was, as it is today, a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary danger. During the day, the heat could be lethal. Temperatures in the open desert regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, and the sand and stone of the desert surface absorbed and radiated heat in waves that shimmered on the horizon. Without adequate water, a traveler could die within hours. Without proper knowledge of the terrain and the location of water sources, even a well-supplied caravan could find itself in mortal danger. Sandstorms could appear without warning, erasing landmarks and burying the road beneath drifts of fine, suffocating sand. The nights, in contrast, could be bitterly cold. Musa's caravan was large enough to carry its own water supply in vast quantities, and it moved along routes where wells and oases were known and reliable. But the logistics of moving 60,000 people across more than 1,000 miles of desert were even so staggering. Food had to be acquired or carried. Sick and injured travelers had to be cared for. Animals had to be managed and watered. The organizational capacity required to keep this moving city alive and functional was immense. Beyond the physical challenges of the crossing, there was also the psychological dimension. For many of the people in Musa's caravan, this was the journey of a lifetime. Many were devout Muslims for whom the Hajj was the culmination of a lifetime's faith. The moment towards their prayers and practices had always been pointing.
To be making this journey in the company of the Mansa himself, to be part of the grandest pilgrimage caravan in living memory, would have been an experience of almost indescribable spiritual intensity. As the caravan crossed the Sahara, it passed through a series of significant stops and waypoints. It moved northeastward, broadly following the established caravan routes, passing through the Great Desert and into the Sahara's northern reaches, before eventually turning east towards Egypt. Along the way, Musa distributed gold. He gave to the poor who gathered at the edges of towns and settlements to watch the procession pass. He gave to mosques and to religious scholars. He gave to officials and governors who came out to greet him. His generosity was not random or thoughtless. It was the expression of his faith, his status, and his personality, all at once. The caravan's passage through the towns and settlements along the route had an effect that went beyond the immediate distribution of gold. It was a demonstration of power, yes, but also of a particular kind of power, the power of organized civilization, of a state that could mobilize resources on this scale and move them across this distance. Every merchant who saw the caravan, every scholar who observed it, every local ruler who came out to pay his respects to the Mansa as he passed, all of them took away an impression of Mali that was impossible to ignore. This was not a barbarian horde passing through. This was an empire.
The camel in all of this deserves a particular note of appreciation. The camel was the technology that made the trans-Saharan trade possible, and by extension was one of the reasons Mansa Musa's wealth existed at all. The dromedary camel, the single-humped variety that populated the Saharan trade routes, is one of the most remarkable animals on Earth in terms of its suitability for desert travel. It can carry loads of several hundred pounds for days at a time in extreme heat. It can go for many days without water, storing fat in its hump and conserving moisture through a variety of extraordinary physiological mechanisms. It can eat the dry, sparse vegetation of the Saharan fringe when nothing else seems edible, and it moves at a steady, patient pace that over the course of a long journey accumulates the miles. Without the camel, the Sahara would have been an almost impassable barrier. With it, the desert became a road. 80 camels reportedly carried the gold in Musa's caravan. Each was loaded between 300 and 600 pounds of gold dust, carefully packed into leather bags and secured to the saddle. The math, even at the lower estimate, is extraordinary. 80 camels carrying 300 pounds each is 24,000 pounds of gold, 12 tons. At the higher estimate, it would be nearly 25 tons. Either figure is almost beyond comprehension when you try to picture it physically. The sheer, dense, gleaming weight of it, swaying on the backs of animals moving steadily through the desert toward the holy city.
And that was only the gold the caravan was known to be carrying openly. There would have been additional gold in the royal treasury wagons and chests, additional reserves carried by officials and attendants. There would have been ivory and salt and other trade goods as well. The total value of goods moving with the caravan was, by any reckoning, an almost incomprehensible figure. The social organization of the caravan was itself a marvel of medieval logistics. A moving community of 60,000 people requires food and water every single day. It requires medical care. It requires the management of disputes and conflicts. It requires communication from front to back and back to front.
It requires people who know the route, and people who know the animals, and people who know how to set up camp quickly and efficiently when evening comes, and people who know how to break camp just as quickly in the morning so that the journey can resume without losing precious hours to the desert heat. Musa had officials and administrators and military officers responsible for all of this. The caravan had its own internal hierarchy, its own chain of command, its own systems and procedures that had been worked out during the months of preparation before departure. It was, in miniature, a portable version of the empire itself. The same structures of authority and management compressed into a moving column and deployed across the landscape.
There were also the spiritual dimensions to manage. A pilgrimage caravan was not merely a logistical exercise, it was a religious community in motion. 5 times a day the caravan halted for prayers. The call to prayer rang out across the desert at dawn and midday and afternoon and sunset and night, and 60,000 voices answered it, turning toward Mecca, prostrating in the sand, fulfilling their obligation to God. In those moments, the caravan was not a demonstration of earthly power. It was a congregation, a community of faith moving together through the world toward the holiest place they knew. By the time the caravan finally reached the Nile Valley and the borders of Egypt, word of its approach had been traveling ahead of it for weeks. Merchants who had encountered the procession in the deep desert had carried stories of its scale and splendor to the cities of North Africa. The Sultan of Egypt had received reports from his own officials and informants along the route. Cairo, the greatest city in the Islamic world at this time, and one of the greatest cities anywhere on earth, was preparing to receive a visitor unlike any it had ever known.
Cairo in the year 1324 was magnificent. It was one of the largest cities in the world, home to perhaps 500,000 people, a metropolis of minarets and markets and scholars and merchants and artisans and saints. It sat astride the Nile, the great river that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. And it was the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, a powerful and sophisticated Islamic state that controlled Egypt, Syria, and the Levant. The Sultan of Egypt at this time was Al-Nasir Muhammad, who was on his 3rd reign. He had come to power, been deposed, come back, been deposed again, and come back a 2nd time, and he was, by the standards of his era, a capable and experienced ruler. Into this magnificent city, in July of 1324, Mansa Musa arrived. The accounts of his arrival in Cairo survive in multiple Arabic sources, and they converge on a consistent picture of almost theatrical spectacle. The caravan, 60,000 strong, approached the city in a display of organized grandeur that left observers struggling for adequate words. The Mansa himself rode at the center of the procession, surrounded by his most senior officials and his personal guard. His horse was magnificent, his clothing was fine beyond description, and around him in every direction the signs of wealth were so abundant and so visible that the people of Cairo, who had seen plenty of wealthy travelers in their time, were left simply speechless.
There is an account recorded by the Egyptian official al-Makrizi of the ceremony in which Musa came before the Sultan of Egypt. The Sultan was seated on his throne, receiving his guest in the traditional manner of Islamic court protocol, which expected guests of lower status to kiss the ground before the Sultan and then kiss the Sultan's hand. Musa reportedly declined to do this, not rudely, but firmly. He was a king himself, he explained. He did not prostrate himself before anyone except God. This created a brief diplomatic awkwardness, the kind of moment where the air in a great hall goes very still, while everyone waits to see how it will be resolved. Eventually, a compromise was found. Some accounts say Musa agreed to bow before God rather than the Sultan. Others say a form of mutual greeting was arranged, and the meeting proceeded amicably. But the moment itself was telling. This was not a supplicant come to beg favor. This was an equal come to pass through. The 3 months that Musa's caravan spent in Cairo were by all accounts extraordinary. The Mansa and his entourage set up in and around the city, and Musa began to give. He gave gold to every poor person who approached him. He gave gold to officials and scholars and religious leaders. He went to the mosques and distributed gold dust to the congregations. He bought goods from Cairo's merchants at prices so generous that the merchants could barely believe their luck. He gave gifts to the Sultan and to the Sultan's household. He gave gold to the city's emirs and to visiting dignitaries. He gave and gave and gave. And in doing so, he accidentally, or perhaps not entirely accidentally, caused an economic catastrophe.
Gold, like all commodities, has a price that is determined by supply and demand. When gold is scarce, it is extremely valuable. When gold is plentiful, its value falls. In 14th century Egypt, the gold market was carefully balanced. Gold coins circulated as currency, gold was used in trade, and the price of gold relative to other goods and commodities had been relatively stable for years. Mansa Musa's arrival changed all of that. He introduced so much gold into the Egyptian economy so quickly, in such enormous quantities, that the supply-demand relationship was fundamentally disrupted. With gold suddenly flooding the markets of Cairo, the value of gold relative to other commodities fell sharply. Prices rose in gold terms, the purchasing power of gold declined. Merchants who held gold found that their reserves were worth less than before. And this effect was not temporary. According to the Arabic historian al-Makrizi, writing about a century after the events, the value of gold in Egypt remained depressed for 12 years after Mansa Musa's visit. 12 years. A single act of generosity so excessive that it functionally crashed the gold market of the most powerful state in the Islamic world and took more than a decade to recover.
There is a wonderful irony in this. The Mali Empire's wealth rested on the high value of gold. The trans-Saharan trade functioned because gold was rare and precious in the north and west, while it was relatively, though not absolutely, more accessible in West Africa. By flooding Cairo with gold dust, Musa was, in a sense, undermining the very mechanism of his own wealth. He did not, apparently, worry about this. Perhaps he was not thinking in those terms. Perhaps he was simply doing what his faith and his nature demanded, giving as much as he could to as many people as he could, trusting that God would provide for the rest. Later in his journey, apparently somewhat aware of the economic disruption he had caused, Musa borrowed gold from Egyptian merchants and moneylenders at interest before he left Cairo, deliberately taking gold out of the Egyptian economy to partially counteract the effect of the gold he had injected. This was noted by al-Umari, who recorded that Musa paid back this borrowed gold on his return journey, and that the debts were eventually settled, though whether completely is uncertain. But beyond the economic drama, Cairo gave Musa something even more valuable than whatever he spent there. It gave him connections. It gave him relationships with scholars, architects, theologians, and artists who would later come to Mali and transform his empire. Most notably, during his time in Cairo, Musa encountered and was greatly impressed by an architect and poet from Andalusian Granada, a man named Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Sahili, also known as Ishaq al-Tuejin, who was then living in Cairo. The story goes that Musa offered him 200 kilos of gold, 200 kilograms, roughly 440 pounds of gold, along with land and slaves along the Niger River, as an incentive to return to Mali with him and lend his architectural talents to the empire. Al-Sahili accepted, and in doing so, set in motion a transformation of Mali's urban landscape that would create some of the most remarkable buildings in medieval Africa.
Section 9. The Road to Mecca. Faith at the Heart of the World. After his extraordinary sojourn in Cairo, the caravan of Mansa Musa moved on. East and south, across the Sinai Peninsula, through the Hejaz, that long strip of territory along the Red Sea coast of the Arabian Peninsula, where the two holiest cities of Islam, Medina and Mecca, were and remain today.
The journey from Cairo to Mecca would have taken several weeks, following routes that were well established and heavily trafficked by pilgrims from across the Islamic world. Mecca in 1324 was already a city that had been receiving pilgrims for centuries, a city organized around the experience of the Hajj, with accommodation and services scaled to the enormous annual influx of travelers who came from every corner of the Muslim world. During the Hajj season, the city swelled from its ordinary population to something many times larger, as pilgrims from Morocco and Egypt and Persia and Central Asia and East Africa and the Indian subcontinent all converged on the small valley in the mountains of Western Arabia, where, according to Islamic tradition, Abraham and his son Ishmael had built the first house of God. For Mansa Musa, arriving at Mecca after a journey that had already covered thousands of miles and taken many months, the experience must have been profoundly moving. Whatever diplomatic and political dimensions his pilgrimage carried, and it carried many, at its heart it was an act of faith. He was a man who prayed 5 times a day, who fasted during Ramadan, who devoted real study and attention to the Quran and to Islamic scholarship. To stand before the Kaaba, to perform the ritual circumambulation of the sacred stone structure at the heart of the Grand Mosque, to drink from the Zamzam well, to make the journey to Arafat and stand in prayer on that plain where, tradition holds, Muhammad delivered his final sermon. These were moments of spiritual intensity that no amount of gold could purchase or replace. The city of Mecca itself, in the 14th century, was shaped entirely by its sacred function. It sat in a valley ringed by rocky hills in the mountains of the Hejaz, a dry and austere landscape that nonetheless felt to the millions of Muslims who came to it like the center of the world. The Grand Mosque, Al-Masjid al-Haram, surrounded the Kaaba at the city's heart, its arcaded halls and open courtyards capable of holding tens of thousands of worshippers. During the Hajj season, those numbers swelled enormously as pilgrims from every corner of the Islamic world arrived, wearing the simple white ihram garments that were the great leveler of the pilgrimage. Rich and poor, king and peasant, Arab and African and Persian and Central Asian and South Asian, all of them dressed alike, all of them performing the same rituals, all of them equal before God. For Mansa Musa, a man who spent his daily life surrounded by the markers and symbols of extraordinary wealth and power, the silk, the gold, the prostrating subjects, the deferential officials, the experience of entering ihram must have been profoundly disorienting in the most meaningful way. Here, in these simple white garments, on this plain and holy ground, he was not the richest man in the world. He was a man, a believer, a pilgrim like all the others. His gold could not follow him into the sacred precincts in the same way it followed him everywhere else. Whatever spiritual purpose the Hajj was meant to serve, the stripping away of worldly identity, the confrontation with one's own smallness before the divine, it would have worked on Musa as it worked on every pilgrim, perhaps more so, given the extremity of the contrast between his ordinary life and this moment of holy simplicity. The Hajj rituals themselves are ancient and carefully prescribed. Pilgrims enter a state of consecration called ihram, wearing simple white garments that symbolize equality before God. There is no distinction of rank or wealth in ihram. The king and the beggar dress the same. They perform the tawaf, the sevenfold circumambulation of the Kaaba. They walk 7 times between the hills of Safa and Marwa, commemorating Hagar's desperate search for water for her son Ishmael. They gather on the plain of Arafat in prayer, the most essential rite of the Hajj, the moment when, in Islamic theology, pilgrims stand before God and seek forgiveness and renewal. They stone the Jamarat, 3 pillars that represent the devil's temptations. They sacrifice an animal in memory of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. And at the end, the pilgrimage is complete, and they are, in the language of Islam, Haji, one who has made the pilgrimage. For Mansa Musa, the physical rituals of the Hajj would have been performed with the full sincerity of a deeply devout man. But even in Mecca, even in the holiest place on earth, the spectacle of his caravan could not be entirely set aside. His generosity continued in the holy city. He gave gold to mosques and to the poor. He made donations to the administrators of the holy sites. He participated in the religious life of Mecca in ways that were remembered and talked about long after he left. The logistics of managing 60,000 pilgrims in Mecca would have required considerable coordination with the authorities of the holy city, who were accustomed to large pilgrimage groups but had never seen anything quite on this scale. Housing, water, food, the management of animals, all of it had to be organized. The city's infrastructure, even augmented by the long traditions of Hajj hospitality, would have been stretched. But Musa's treasury was available to smooth over any difficulties, and his officials were experienced enough to manage the practicalities without creating disruptions that would interfere with the sacred character of the occasion. He also spent time in Medina, the city where the Prophet Muhammad had lived and died, and where his tomb is located. A visit to Medina, al-Ziyarah, is not technically part of the Hajj, but is deeply important to many Muslim pilgrims who travel the extra distance to pay respects at the Prophet's mosque. For Musa, This too was a moment of profound significance. The Prophet's mosque in Medina, originally built by Muhammad himself and expanded many times since, is one of the most sacred places in Islam, and to pray there, in the city where the faith was shaped and established, was to connect oneself to the very origins of the religion.
When the pilgrimage was complete, Mansa Musa began the long journey home. But he did not return the same man who had left. He was going home with his faith deepened, his connections broadened, his ambitions sharpened by everything he had seen and everyone he had met. He was going home with al-Sahili, the architect, in his entourage, and with a collection of scholars and poets and religious teachers who had agreed to come and settle in Mali. He was going home with a vision of what his empire could be, not just the richest kingdom in the world, but one of its most learned and most beautiful. Section 10. The Return. A changed man, a transformed empire. The return journey from Mecca to Mali was, like the outward journey, a long and arduous crossing of desert and savanna, mountain and river. But something in the quality of the journey was different. The frantic, world-announcing spectacle of the outward trip, the 60,000 strong, the gold flying in every direction, the jaws dropping from Egypt to the Holy Land, was behind him. What lay ahead was the work, the real work, not the performance of wealth and faith, but the substance of governance and building and transformation.
We know from historical sources that the return journey included a significant military event that serves as a reminder that Mansa Musa was not only a pious pilgrim, but also an emperor who thought constantly about the strategic interests of his domain. While he was in the West on his pilgrimage, he had left his empire in capable hands, but he had also deployed his military strategically. One of his generals, a man named Sagmandia, had used the Mansa's absence as an opportunity to extend the empire's territory in the east, capturing the Songhai capital of Gao on the Great Bend of the Niger River. When Musa came through Gao on his return journey, the city was already flying his banners. He visited it, received its submission, and continued home, his empire now measurably larger than when he had left. The acquisition of Gao was strategically significant for several reasons. Gao was an important commercial center, a hub of trade on the Niger, and its control gave Mali a firmer grip on the eastern reaches of the trans-Saharan trade network. It also extended Mali's dominion over the Songhai people, who would, after Mali's eventual decline, become the dominant power of the Western Sudan. But in 1325, the Songhai were subjects of Mali, their capital in Musa's hands, their trading routes taxed by his treasury. By the time the caravan finally reached Niani, the capital of Mali, Musa had been gone for approximately a year and a half. He returned to find his empire intact and functioning, a tribute to the governing structures he had put in place before departure, but also hungry for its attention and his presence. A kingdom feels the absence of its ruler, the decisions that have been deferred, the disputes that have been kept on hold, the questions that require the Mansa's personal authority. They all pile up, waiting. But even as he returned to the daily rhythms of governance, Musa's mind was already on something larger. He was thinking about his cities. He was thinking about Timbuktu. He was thinking about Gao and Jenne and Niani. He had seen what the great cities of the Islamic world looked like. He had walked through Cairo and Medina and Mecca. He had seen mosques that soared over the rooftops, their minarets visible for miles.
He had seen madrasas where hundreds of students bent over their manuscripts, learning mathematics and law and theology and poetry. He had seen courts where scholars debated fine points of Quranic interpretation, where astronomers tracked the movements of stars, where physicians treated illness with knowledge accumulated over centuries. He wanted all of that for his empire. He wanted Mali to be not just the richest kingdom in the world, but one of the most learned. And he had, accompanying him on his return, exactly the person he needed to begin. Section 11. Building Timbuktu, the city of gold and knowledge.
Timbuktu. The name itself has traveled across centuries and languages and become, in English and French and many other tongues, a byword for remoteness, for the ends of the earth, for a place impossibly far away. That's in Timbuktu, people say, meaning it might as well be on the moon. The real Timbuktu, the 14th century Timbuktu that Mansa Musa helped transform, was something quite different from the exotic, unreachable mirage the name conjures. It was a real city, a working city, a trading city, and under Musa's patronage, it became one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The city sat at the edge of the Sahara, at the northern bend of the Niger River, where the desert and the savannah met, and the caravan routes from the north connected with the river routes of the south. Its position was, like so many great medieval cities, primarily economic. It was where the camel traders of the Sahara met the river merchants of the Niger Delta, where salt from the north was exchanged for gold and grain and cola nuts and slaves from the south. Markets were its heartbeat, commerce was its air. But Timbuktu was also, by the time of Mansa Musa, already a place of learning. There were mosques and schools and scholars before Musa arrived. What Musa did was take what was already there and amplify it, enrich it, and transform it from a provincial trading town into a city of international reputation. Al-Sahili, the architect he had brought back from Cairo, was set to work immediately. His first commission was a grand mosque, the Jingareba Mosque, also known as the Great Mosque of Timbuktu. This building, constructed in the distinctive style of West African Islamic architecture, was extraordinary. It was built using beaten earth, banko, a local building material that is the clay and sand of the Saharan fringe, mixed with water and molded into bricks or shaped directly into walls. This technique was not Al-Sahili's invention. It had been used in the region for centuries, but he brought to it the design sensibility of a trained architect from the sophisticated tradition of Andalusian Islamic architecture, and the result was a building of real grandeur. The mosque had a distinctive silhouette, with projecting wooden beams, called torons, sticking out of the exterior walls at regular intervals. These beams served both a structural purpose, reinforcing the earth walls, and a visual one, giving the building a rhythmic, textured appearance, unlike anything else in medieval architecture. The Jingarebe Mosque was completed around 1330, and it still stands today. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the oldest and most remarkable mosques in sub-Saharan Africa, and it is a direct physical link to Mansa Musa and his vision. When you look at photographs of this building, its earthen walls warm in the afternoon sun, its conical minarets reaching upward, its forecourt open to the sky, you are looking at something that Musa commissioned with gold he had carried across the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula, something that Al-Sahili designed with skills he had brought from the other end of the Mediterranean world. It is a physical embodiment of the connection Musa forged between West Africa and the wider Islamic civilization. But the mosque was only the beginning. Musa also ordered the construction of a royal palace, the Madugu, in Timbuktu, a great hall where the Mansa's officials could administer the city's affairs, where guests could be received, and where the business of imperial governance could be conducted in appropriate style. He commissioned buildings in Gao as well, the newly acquired Songhai capital that he was determined to integrate properly into his empire. And beyond the physical buildings, Musa invested heavily in the intellectual life of his cities. He imported scholars from across the Islamic world. He offered salaries and accommodations and libraries to learned men who were willing to come and teach in his empire. He encouraged his subjects to pursue education, sponsoring students who showed promise. He ensured that the mosques of Timbuktu and the other major cities were connected to teaching circles, the informal but structured gatherings around learned scholars that formed the basic unit of Islamic education throughout the medieval period.
Over time, these teaching circles and the institutions that supported them coalesced into something more formal. The Mosque of Sankore in Timbuktu, which had existed before Musa's time but was greatly expanded and enriched during his reign and reigns of his immediate successors, became the heart of what is sometimes called the University of Sankore. This was not a university in the modern Western sense. It had no fixed curriculum, no formal degree programs, no graduation ceremonies. It was more like a great congregation of scholars, each of whom taught and learned and debated within his own circle, and the whole of which added up to a remarkable concentration of intellectual life. At its height, in the late 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu may have had as many as 25,000 students, a number that would have made it one of the largest centers of learning in the medieval world. The subjects studied were wide-ranging. Theology and Quranic studies were the foundation, as they were in all Islamic educational institutions. But beyond that, students and scholars at Timbuktu engaged with history, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and literature. Manuscripts were copied, collected, and preserved. Libraries accumulated. At the peak of Timbuktu's intellectual life, the city is estimated to have held anywhere from 300,000 to 1 million manuscripts, an extraordinary archive of human knowledge that was, tragically, largely scattered or destroyed in subsequent centuries of war and neglect, though significant portions survive in Malian collections today. This was Mansa Musa's true legacy in Timbuktu. Not the gold he gave away or the impressions he left in Cairo, not even the spectacular mosque, but the accumulation of knowledge, the gathering of minds, the quiet daily work of learning that went on in the teaching circles and the libraries and the courts of the scholars he brought to his cities. For this, more than anything else, history owes him an enduring debt. Section 12. The Catalan Atlas and Europe's Obsession. While Mansa Musa was busy building mosques and universities in the heart of West Africa, something was happening in Europe. Something small but significant. Something that would, in the centuries to come, contribute to both great voyages of discovery and great crimes of colonialism. The story of his pilgrimage was spreading. News of Musa's extraordinary caravan had reached Egypt, and from Egypt it reached the trading cities of North Africa, Tunis, Fez, Algiers, Tripoli. From there, through the networks of Mediterranean merchants and diplomats, stories and fragments of the tale continued to move northward, into the ports of southern Europe, into the ears of geographers and cartographers and merchants and explorers who were always listening for any intelligence about sources of goods that the world wanted.
And what the world wanted in the 14th century was gold.
The stories that circulated were necessarily garbled by the time they reached Europe, filtered through multiple languages and multiple tellings, stripped of nuance and context, and embellished by the storytelling instincts of every person who repeated them. What emerged in the European imagination was not a nuanced portrait of a sophisticated ruler with a complex empire and a genuine religious mission. It was an image of a man of impossible, almost supernatural wealth, sitting on a throne of gold, in a land of gold, in a place so far away and so fabulous that it seemed more like a dream than a geography. This image was literalized in one of the most remarkable and important documents of the medieval period. In 1375, more than 3 decades after Mansa Musa's death, a Spanish cartographer named Abraham Cresques, working on the island of Majorca, which was then an important center of Mediterranean cartography, produced a magnificent illustrated map of the known world. This map is called the Catalan Atlas, and it is one of the most beautiful and detailed medieval maps that survives. On this map, in the section depicting West Africa, there is a figure, a large, crowned, robed figure sitting on a golden throne, holding in one hand a golden scepter and in the other a large golden nugget, looking directly out at the viewer with an expression of serene authority. This figure is labelled in the Catalan text of the Atlas as Musa Mali, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. The accompanying text describes him as the richest and most noble king in all the land, famous for the wealth and abundance of his country. The Catalan Atlas circulated among the rulers, merchants, and navigators of medieval Europe, and Mansa Musa's image on it became a fixed reference point in European geographical consciousness. When Portuguese navigators began pushing down the west coast of Africa in the early 15th century, first Ceuta, then Cape Bojador, then the Senegalese coast, one of the things driving their curiosity and their ambition was the memory of this image. The man on the golden throne, surrounded by gold, somewhere in the interior of West Africa. They wanted to find him. They wanted to find the source of all that gold. They never found Mansa Musa, of course. He had been dead for more than a century by the time the Portuguese reached the West African coast in any systematic way. And the Mali Empire was already a shadow of its former self, weakened by succession struggles and the rising power of the Songhai. But the quest that his image inspired, the determination to find a direct sea route to the sources of African gold and to trade directly with West Africa without the intermediation of the trans-Saharan routes and the North African merchants who controlled them, was a real force in the history of European exploration, and it played a role in shaping the Age of Discovery. This is one of the strange and sobering threads in Mansa Musa's legacy. His pilgrimage, undertaken in a spirit of faith and generosity, made his empire famous across the medieval world. That fame eventually contributed to European interest in West Africa. That interest, over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, curdled into something much darker, the transatlantic slave trade, which would devastate West Africa and the African diaspora for centuries. Musa could not have foreseen this. No one could have. But history is not a simple story, and the consequences of great events are rarely only what their authors intended.
The legal system of the empire blended Islamic law, Sharia, with traditional Mandinka customary law, creating a hybrid system that was flexible enough to govern a diverse population. Islamic law was applied most strictly in matters concerning the Muslim community, particularly in urban centers and among the educated and mercantile classes. Traditional customs and local practices were generally respected in rural communities and among non-Muslim populations, as long as they did not conflict with the Mansa's authority or the empire's interests. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveller and chronicler who visited Mali in the early 1350s, a decade or so after Mansa Musa's death, left us one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of daily life in the empire. His account is invaluable, though it must be read with some awareness that he was visiting a Mali already in the early stages of decline from Musa's peak, and that his observations reflect both genuine admiration and the occasional cultural misunderstanding of an outsider. What Ibn Battuta describes is a society of remarkable order and stability. The roads and the trade routes were safe. A single woman, he notes, could travel anywhere in the empire without fear. Property was secure. The administration of justice was consistent enough that people generally trusted it. Merchants from distant lands could trade in Mali's markets without fear of being cheated or robbed, because the Mansa's authority was sufficient to guarantee contracts and punish violations.
He was particularly struck by the strong sense of social obligation. The people of Mali, he noted, were assiduous in their prayers, careful in their maintenance of their religious duties, and deeply committed to their community bonds. They were also, he noted with some surprise, not especially deferential to foreign visitors. They had their own customs, their own standards of behavior, their own codes of respect and dignity, and they expected visitors to observe them. This was not a population overawed by outside authority. It was a confident, settled, self-respecting society. The markets of the empire cities were lively and well organized. Djenné, which was one of the great trading cities of the Niger inland delta, hosted a weekly market that was among the largest in the entire medieval Islamic world, drawing merchants from hundreds of miles around. Timbuktu's markets were similarly active, a meeting point for Saharan camel traders, river merchants, and the agents of distant rulers. Gold dust was the primary currency in major transactions, carefully measured and weighed on scales that were themselves subject to official standards and inspection. The agricultural life of the empire was organized around the rhythms of the Niger River. The great annual flood, which inundated the plains of the inland delta each year after the rains, left behind rich deposits of alluvial soil that supported abundant harvests of millet, sorghum, and rice. The river also provided fish, an important source of protein, and the seasonal movement of the floodwaters created a complex ecological mosaic of wetlands, grasslands, and drier zones that supported cattle herding alongside farming. This agricultural and pastoral diversity made the empire's food supply resilient. A drought that damaged one type of production might not affect the others.
The cities, at their best under Mansa Musa, were places of genuine urban sophistication. They had mosques and markets and schools and libraries. They had artisans producing textiles, leather goods, metalwork, and pottery. They had musicians and griots who preserved the oral traditions of the dynasty and performed them at court and in public spaces. They had visiting scholars and merchants who brought with them books and ideas and goods from Egypt and North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and Persia and beyond. It is worth pausing here to consider the texture of daily life in Timbuktu at the height of Mansa Musa's reign, because it is so different from the image that many people carry of medieval Africa, an image that, it must be said plainly, has been distorted by centuries of Eurocentric historical narrative. Timbuktu in the 1320s and 1330s was a city of perhaps 25,000 permanent residents, swelling considerably during the trading seasons when caravans arrived from the north and river merchants converged from the south. Its streets were organized around the great mosques and the markets, with residential quarters of flat-roofed earthen houses spreading out in every direction. The houses of the wealthy were large and comfortable, built around interior courtyards that provided shade and privacy, with smooth plastered walls and wooden doors carved with geometric patterns. The houses of ordinary people were smaller, but no less carefully made, built from the same beaten earth construction that suited the climate perfectly, warm in the cool desert nights, cool in the blazing days. The sounds of the city would have been a mix of the familiar and the extraordinary, the call to prayer 5 times a day echoing from the minarets, the din of the market, vendors calling their wares, the haggling of merchants in 6 languages, the lowing of cattle and the complaining of camels, the sound of scholars in the teaching circles, reciting and debating, their voices rising and falling in the rhythms of Quranic Arabic, the thud of a weaver's loom, the hammer of a blacksmith, the laughter of children chasing each other through the narrow lanes between the houses, the distant sound of a griot singing praise, the complex rhythms of the kora or the balathon threading through the afternoon air. The food would have been the food of the Sahel, millet porridge thick and hot, dried fish from the river, roasted meat on feast days, dates and dried fruits carried in by the northern caravans, fresh vegetables when the season allowed. Tea, that essential lubricant of Saharan social life, would have been prepared and shared with the deliberate ceremony that still characterizes it in the region today. 3 glasses, each different, each with its particular meaning. The slow brewing and pouring and re-pouring, a form of hospitality that turns a simple drink into a ritual of community. It was, in other words, a real city, a human city, a place where people lived and worked and argued and prayed and fell in love and grew old and died. Not a symbol, not a legend, just a place where human beings had built something remarkable out of the materials availed to them, the earth of the desert, the water of the river, the faith in their hearts, and the accumulated knowledge of generations. Musa himself maintained a court of considerable splendor. He received ambassadors and sent them. He communicated with the rulers of other Islamic states, establishing the Mali Empire as a peer of the great powers of the medieval Islamic world, rather than a peripheral curiosity. He corresponded with the Sultan of Morocco, with the rulers of Egypt, with other kings and sultans across the Islamic world. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, a statesman. He was also, for all his wealth and power, a human being. The sources paint a picture of a man who was genuinely devout in his faith, genuinely serious about the responsibilities of governance, and genuinely generous in a way that was not merely performative. He cared about his people. He wanted his empire to be more than a machine for generating gold. He wanted it to be a place where people lived well, prayed sincerely, and learned freely. Section 14. The Decline of the Mali Empire after Musa. Mansa Musa died sometime around 1332 or 1337. The sources differ, and the uncertainty is a reminder of how much the historical record of medieval West Africa depends on fragmentary and sometimes contradictory sources. He had ruled for approximately 25 years, and in those 25 years he had taken the Mali Empire to the very peak of its power, its wealth, and its international reputation.
What followed was a story that has repeated itself many times in the history of great empires. The reign of an exceptional ruler leaves a void that is very difficult to fill. The institutions, the structures, the systems that the great ruler built may continue to function for a time on their own momentum, but without the guiding intelligence and the forceful personality that created them, they begin to drift. Musa was succeeded by his son, Mansa Musa I, who ruled from approximately 1337 to 1341. Margan had served as regent during his father's absence on the Hajj, and he had some administrative experience, but he lacked his father's particular combination of military competence, diplomatic skill, and religious authority. During his brief reign, the empire faced its first significant external challenge in years. The Mossi people of the south made raids into the empire's territory. There were signs of instability in the provinces. The firm, confident control that Musa had exercised began to relax at the edges. Margan died after only 4 years and was succeeded by his uncle, Mansa Suleiman, who was Musa's younger brother and who ruled from around 1341 to 1360. Suleiman was actually a reasonably capable ruler. He was the one who received Ibn Battuta in 1352 and whose court the Moroccan traveller described with some admiration. He maintained the empire structure, continued to promote Islam, and kept the trade routes functioning. But the decline was beginning. The empire's grip on its more distant provinces was loosening. The Songhai in the east were restless. The Tuareg nomads of the Saharan fringe were increasingly bold in their raids. After Suleiman's death, the succession became more turbulent. A series of rulers, some capable and some not, struggled to maintain the empire's coherence. Internal conflicts over succession drained resources and attention from governance. Regional governors grew more autonomous, less reliably loyal to the central authority in Niani. The trade routes, while still functioning, were less securely controlled than in Musa's time. The 15th century brought more serious challenges. The Songhai Empire, centered on Gao, the very city that Mansa Musa's general had captured in 1325, grew increasingly powerful under its great ruler Sunni Ali, who reigned from 1464 to 1492. Sunni Ali was a military genius of almost terrifying effectiveness, and under his leadership the Songhai systematically dismantled Mali's authority over the Niger Bend region, capturing Timbuktu in 1468 and Djenné in 1473. These were devastating blows. Timbuktu and Djenné were not merely important cities, they were the economic and intellectual heart of the empire. Their loss meant that the trade revenues that had sustained Mali's wealth were now flowing to Songhai rather than to Niani. There was also the slow but steady shift in the global gold trade. For centuries, the trans-Saharan routes had been essentially the only way for West African gold to reach the Mediterranean and beyond. But in the latter half of the 15th century, the Portuguese were pushing down the West African coast, and by the 1470s they were trading directly with gold-producing peoples on the Guinea coast, acquiring gold by sea without going through the Saharan intermediaries. This did not immediately destroy the trans-Saharan trade, which continued in reduced form for centuries more, but it began to erode the competitive advantage that had made Mali's position so valuable.
By the 16th century, the Mali Empire was a shadow of what it had been. It survived in a reduced form, governing a rump territory in the western Sudan, until the early 17th century, when Moroccan invaders crossed the Sahara with muskets and gunpowder weapons and shattered the remaining power structures of the region. But by that point, the Mali Empire that Mansa Musa had ruled was already a thing of memory, preserved in the stories of the griots and the writings of Arab historians. The Songhai Empire that replaced Mali as the dominant power of the Western Sudan was itself eventually destroyed by the Moroccan invasion of 1591 to 1593. And the trans-Saharan trade that had sustained the prosperity of the region for centuries was never quite the same again. The great trading cities of the Niger Bend, Timbuktu, Djenné, Gao, survived but were diminished, their populations reduced, their intellectual life quieter, their markets less busy. The manuscripts that had accumulated in their libraries were scattered. Some were hidden by families who recognized their value. Some were destroyed. Some were carried away. Many simply crumbled in the dust. It is a melancholy ending to a great story, but it is also, in its way, universal. All empires end. All peaks are followed by valleys. The measure of a civilization is not whether it lasts forever, nothing does, but what it produced while it flourished, and what echoes of that production continue to be felt long after the original moment has passed. Section 15. The Legacy. The echo of a golden age. And so we arrive, quietly, at the question that any honest account of Mansa Musa must eventually ask. What remains? After the gold was spent, and the caravans disbanded, and the empire crumbled, and the centuries piled up like sand against a wall, what remains of the man and what he built and what he stood for? More than you might expect, much more. The most visible legacy is architectural. The Djinguireba Mosque in Timbuktu, commissioned by Musa and built by al-Sahili, still stands. It has been restored and rebuilt many times over the centuries. Earthen architecture requires constant maintenance, and the mosque has been a living, worshipping community space, not a museum, for nearly 700 years. It is not in perfect original condition, and it cannot be. But its essential form, its spirit, its presence in the landscape of Timbuktu is a direct connection to Mansa Musa. When people worship there today, they do so in a space that exists because he commanded it to be built. The intellectual legacy is also present, though more diffuse and harder to trace. Timbuktu did not maintain its peak scholarly status after the Moroccan invasion of the 16th century, and many of its manuscripts were dispersed. But the tradition of Islamic scholarship in West Africa that Musa nurtured and encouraged during his reign has never entirely died. It has continued, in various forms and at various intensities, through the centuries since his time. There are scholars in Timbuktu today who can trace their intellectual genealogy through unbroken chains of teachers and students back to the great scholars of the 14th century. There are families in Mali who have preserved manuscripts in private collections for generations, slowly bringing them back to public attention in recent decades through the work of archives like the Ahmad Baba Institute in Timbuktu. There is also the legacy of his pilgrimage on the maps and the imagination of the world. The Catalan Atlas, which we have discussed, was not the only map to depict Musa. He appears in various forms in medieval and early modern European geographical traditions, always associated with gold, always associated with the wealth of Africa. His name travelled in ways that his own body never could. It reached places he never went, and people he never met, and times he never lived to see. It is a strange and somewhat ironic immortality, to be known in the end, less for the faith that motivated your greatest action, than for the wealth that made that action visible.
But perhaps the most important legacy of Mansa Musa is conceptual. He is proof, evidence in historical form, that the narrative of African history that treats the continent as a passive backdrop to the dramas of other civilizations is simply wrong. West Africa in the 14th century was not a blank space on the map waiting for civilization to arrive from elsewhere. It was a center of civilization. It was home to an empire that matched or exceeded the richest states of Europe and the Middle East in its organization, its wealth, its cultural sophistication, and its intellectual ambition. The poverty and disruption that characterized much of West Africa in later centuries, after the Atlantic slave trade, after colonialism, after the economic distortions introduced by centuries of extractive relationships with the outside world, these were not the original condition. They were the result of specific historical forces, most of them externally imposed, that destroyed what had been built. Mansa Musa's story is a reminder of what was there before. It is a reminder of the depth and richness of African history. It is a reminder that human beings everywhere, in every era, have been capable of building great things when circumstances and leadership and resources aligned in the right way.
His story is also, in a quieter way, a meditation on the nature of wealth itself. He was, by virtually every measure that historians have been able to apply, the wealthiest individual human being who ever lived. Do with that wealth. He spent it. He gave it away. He poured it into buildings and books and the salaries of scholars and the distribution of alms to the poor. He used it to forge connections between his empire and the wider world, to bring knowledge and beauty into the cities of his domain, to express his faith in the most lavishly generous way he could imagine. He was not, in the end, defined by his wealth. He was defined by what he did with it. Modern estimates place his fortune at figures that make even today's wealthiest individuals look modest. The combined net worth of the wealthiest people alive today, from the tech billionaires of Silicon Valley to the oil sheikhs of the Gulf, does not approach, in terms of proportional share of global wealth, what Mansa Musa commanded at the peak of his reign. He was, in that sense, a truly singular figure in human history. There has been nothing quite like him before or since. And yet what the stories remember most vividly is not the number, it is the image. The man on the camel, moving slowly across the desert, surrounded by 60,000 people and 80 camels of gold, giving it all away as he goes. The king who crashed an economy with kindness. The ruler who built a university in the sand. The pilgrim who changed the maps of the world.
There is also something worth dwelling on in the way that Mansa Musa's legacy survived, despite, or perhaps because of, the relatively sparse written record from within Mali itself.
The great irony of his fame is that we know him primarily through the writings of outsiders. Al-Umari, who never met Musa directly but interviewed people who had seen him in Cairo, left us some of the most detailed descriptions of the pilgrimage and its effects. Ibn Khaldun, writing later, synthesized various sources into a broader account of the Mali Empire's history. Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali after Musa's death, described the empire Musa left behind. These Arab scholars preserved in their careful, inquisitive prose the memory of a man and an empire that might otherwise have faded entirely from the world's awareness. The griots of Mali preserved different things: the oral traditions, the epic narratives, the genealogies and praise songs that kept the Keita dynasty's memory alive within West African culture. These oral traditions carried their own truths, sometimes different from the written Arabic sources, sometimes complementary, always deeply rooted in the lived experience of the people rather than the observations of visiting scholars. Together, the written and oral records create a picture that is incomplete but vivid, fragmentary but real.
There is a lesson in this, perhaps, about the nature of historical memory. Mansa Musa's story reached us through multiple channels: the Arabic scholars of the Islamic world, the European cartographers who put his image on their maps, the griots who sang his praises across the generations, and eventually the modern historians who pieced it all together from these scattered sources. Each telling adds something, and each also leaves something out. The Mansa Musa who appears in the Catalan Atlas, that golden-robed figure holding his nugget like a trophy, is a European projection of African wealth, stripped of context and complexity. The Mansa Musa of the griot tradition is a different figure, an ancestor, a symbol of dynasty and achievement, celebrated within a living cultural context. The Mansa Musa of the Arab historians is a third figure, a powerful ruler observed from the perspective of educated Muslim travelers who admired his piety and were astonished by his wealth. The Mansa Musa of history, the actual human being who lived and ruled and prayed and governed and died in the 14th century, that figure can only be approached by holding all these different perspectives at once, allowing them to overlap and contradict and complement each other, and accepting that what emerges will always be partial, always be a reconstruction, always be a version, rather than the thing itself. But that is true of all history. Every figure from the past reaches us through filters, and the filters are part of the story. What matters is that Mansa Musa's story has survived in its various versions and continues to matter. It continues to be told. It continues to spark curiosity and wonder and pride and reflection. It continues to do what the best history does. It reminds us that the world was always larger and richer and more complicated than the narrow slice of it that any one of us is born into, and that the human beings who populated that larger world were fully, completely, remarkably human, with all the grandeur and the limitation that entails. That is who Mansa Musa was. And that is why 7 centuries after his death, we are still telling his story in the quiet hours of the night, when the world has gone still and sleep is drifting closer, and the distance between now and then feels, for a moment, very small. And so the story of Mansa Musa comes to rest, as all stories must, in the quiet, not in a palace, not on a throne, not at the head of a golden procession crossing the desert, but here,
in the hush of wherever you are tonight, in the dark behind your closed eyes, in the gentle weight of sleep beginning to settle over you, warm and patient, the way it always has, the way it will continue long after our own stories have been told.
He lived, this extraordinary man. He walked on the same earth you walk on, breathed the same air, carried the same questions about meaning and faith and legacy that all of us carry. He was born into wealth he did not choose and died in the fullness of a life that he shaped with intention and intelligence and a generous spirit into something genuinely remarkable. He left behind buildings that still stand. He left behind a tradition of scholarship that, however dimmed by subsequent centuries, has never entirely gone out. He left behind his name on the maps of the world, his image in the margins of ancient atlases, his story in the writings of scholars who met him and scholars who heard of him, and scholars who will continue to study him for as long as human beings are curious about the past. He left behind most of all the simple and humbling fact that once in the 14th century there was a man who controlled more gold than anyone in human history, and who used it to pray and to give and to build and to connect his people to the broader conversation of human civilization. That is enough, more than enough. It is, in fact, extraordinary.
Think of him for a moment in this closing quiet. Not the grand symbolic figure on the Catalan atlas, not the statistic in a history book, not the name attached to a staggering number. Think of him as a person, a man who rose before dawn each morning and prayed in the dark, as devout Muslims do, in the cool hour before the sun climbed over the Sahelian horizon and the world filled with heat and noise and obligation. A man who sat through long, tedious administrative meetings, listening to governors report on grain harvests and tax shortfalls and disputes over wells and grazing rights, the same mundane business of governance that rulers have always had to attend to. A man who somewhere in the middle of all that wealth and power and responsibility quietly decided that he wanted to see the holy city with his own eyes, to feel the sacred ground under his own feet, to be for once not an emperor but simply a believer, making his way across the world toward the place where his faith began.
The desert through which he travelled is still there. The Sahara has not moved, not in any meaningful human timescale. The sands shift, the dunes rearrange themselves in the wind. But the desert itself, that vast and ancient sea of stone and heat and silence, is as it was in the 14th century. If you could stand in the right place on the right day and look eastward, you might, with the right quality of imagination, see the dust cloud on the horizon, the shimmer of silk in the morning light, the long swaying silhouettes of laden camels moving patiently through the heat, the sound of prayer rising over the caravan as the sun climbs in the sky. He was heading toward God. He was heading toward Mecca. He was heading, though he could not have known it, toward an immortality of a very particular kind, the immortality of a story that refuses to be forgotten, that keeps circulating through the centuries, that keeps finding new ears and new voices and new contexts in which to be told and retold. 700 years have passed since he walked across the Sahara.
And here we are, tonight, still speaking his name in the quiet, still following his caravan in the dark, still listening for the distant sound of gold shifting on the backs of camels in a desert that has long since swallowed every footprint he ever left.
The mosques he built are still standing in the dust of Timbuktu. The manuscripts that accumulated in the libraries he founded, though much dispersed and much destroyed, still exist in fragments in archives and private collections across West Africa. The memory of his empire, preserved in the oral traditions of the Mandinka people and in the writings of Arab scholars, is still alive in the world. And every time his story is told, every time someone reads about the pilgrimage, or looks at the Catalan Atlas, or visits the Jingareba Mosque, or simply hears his name for the first time and feels that particular quickening of curiosity that great history always provokes, Mansa Musa lives again. Briefly, but really, in the imagination of another human being. That is the only immortality any of us can hope for. Not the kind that outlasts the body forever, but the kind that passes from one mind to another, generation after generation, as long as someone cares enough to remember and to tell. Let the desert wind carry the last of these words away. Let the image of the golden caravan fade gently, like a candle going out in a warm room. Let the minarets of Timbuktu stand quiet against the evening sky, patient and old and beautiful. Let the Niger River flow on in the dark, carrying its quiet cargo of silt and memory toward the distant sea. Let the stars that burned over the Sahara in 1324 burn on, uncaring and magnificent, in the same sky above your roof tonight. The same stars they always were, indifferent to centuries, indifferent to empires, indifferent to everything except the long, long business of burning.
Let sleep come now, as it has always come, carrying you out beyond the reach of the day into the deeper country where rest lives. You have traveled a long way tonight, across the Sahara and the centuries, across the sand and the story. You have met a king. You have walked for a few quiet hours in the long shadow of a golden age. Sleep well. The history will still be here when you wake. And if tonight's journey through history brought you some peace, some wonder, some sense of the deep and extraordinary breadth of the human story, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Heyo, Boring History for Sleep. We are a small channel with a big heart, and we are working toward 1,000 subscribers, a humble milestone, but one that would mean the world to me. Like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. And if you have any sleepy hype left at all, send it this way. It costs you nothing, and it helps this little channel keep the fire burning, keep the stories coming, keep the lights on in this quiet corner of the past. Thank you for being here, truly. Good night.